Traces of the past. I must say that the style of our old friends' conversations, which were a mix of humor and didacticism, jumping from one topic to another and often losing the thread, was quite effective. When he didn't draw attention to the connections in his speech, it was inevitable that we would later engage in discussions among ourselves to figure out what he had said between the lines. That day, we clearly experienced this in the examples he gave from his own life about human relationships. Moreover, he dove right into the subject. We wanted to spend our days immersed in books, in the peaceful, quiet environment of the department library, until our hair turned white. But that was just a dream. When the day came, they graduated us and sent us on our way. I don't remember exactly, but there was a principle that the school aimed to instill a kind of universal perspective. I can't recall if it was written on marble somewhere in the school or if I read it somewhere else. And when we were thrown into life which wasn't written in books, we felt like fish out of water. We were ignorant of life, yet the love of learning was so strong that we were open to learning even from our students. Even though many years have passed, I don't remember why we argued, but I will never forget the ticket clerk at the station in a distant city saying, "What, are we bad people now?" My week-long journey by bicycle had come to an end. I felt an unbearable discomfort and drowsiness. The accumulated fatigue of that week was more than I could bear. I wanted to board the train that would take me almost from one end of the country to the other as soon as possible, and, if possible, close my eyes where I was sitting. The ticket clerk had issued a luggage ticket for the bicycle, for a location further away than the destination station. I didn't think much of it. However, the next day, when I arrived at my destination, I realized that the ticket sales clerk was a bad person when the conductor refused to deliver the bicycle 50 kilometers before the destination. Someone asked, "So did you get the bicycle?" Our old friend pretended not to hear the question. I have experienced this manifestation of status difference in human relations in other examples as well. When I felt it was pointless to ask the director of the tax office a question about my car tax, I realized that I was faced with a mentality that viewed citizens as potential tax evaders before I even asked the question. I felt as though I had been slapped. However, my exposure to such behavior was not limited to this. During my car journey, when I was stopped for a check by traffic police, I encountered an unexpected behavior from the young officer. He clearly asked for money for food. I was shocked. I took out some money and gave it to him. Since I didn't eat at the restaurant, I didn't know the prices. The police officer said it wasn't enough and increased the amount. Without hesitation, I paid the rest. Then I continued on my way. Although regulations introduced over time to police practices have helped prevent similar incidents, this situation remains one of those cases I cannot suppress or forget. There is no end to such incidents. It is even more surprising to see them in the civilian sphere. An experience I had at a bank regarding my business not being handled also ranks among the unforgettable ones. While the bank clerk was handling a friend's business, my queue number appeared on the screen. Then the queue passed, and he only finished his friend's business. When the clerk told me that my turn had passed, I lost my temper. At that moment, I thought I had encountered a situation that I could only encounter in the private sector or in government offices. There were also interrogations. While taking photographs of historically significant buildings in the interior of the country with your camera, it was quite common for a curious passerby to approach you and ask, "What are you doing?" However, it was no longer common for a municipal employee to invite you to a workplace to question you about your suspicious behavior. The police chief, who was reading poetry from outside, applied interrogation techniques that would put a security officer to shame, which was a successful example of looking for a needle in a haystack. Fortunately, my friends who had come with me stepped in and vouched for me, resulting in a disappointing experience for the police. I experienced a similar incident with a district governor. I didn't laugh, but some of my friends couldn't help but burst into laughter. While producing programs for local television as a hobby, the fact that officials would always interfere with my video recordings was causing serious problems for the work I was preparing. Finally, when the television manager obtained official permission from the province, things went smoothly for a while. However, when the programs were broadcast to the districts, I shot myself in the foot. One day, when I visited the district governor in the district I was in, I told him I wanted to film a video about historical values. I had the document issued by the provincial governor's office with me. At that moment, I felt as anxious as if I were facing a prosecutor instead of the district governor. "This permit is valid for the city center, not here," he said. Then he added, "I don't know you." Disappointed and in low spirits, I left the district governor's office. That day, I took the photos quickly, feeling scared. And as I left the district, I took a deep breath. Years later, when I looked up that district governor, I found out he had died of cancer. On different occasions, while searching for a location in the field or photographing stars in pitch darkness, I encountered the gendarmerie. By then, I was already pulling out my ID for a GBT check without being asked. When I began exploring a city renowned for its commercial acumen at dawn, I saw that an island consisting of several plots had been demolished in the name of urban renewal. However, what captivated me was that the few ruins still standing reflected the city's historical identity. I photographed a few architectural details. I stopped at a neighborhood mosque. The minaret's balcony, surrounded by columns, reflected an identity dating back centuries and was about to disappear as part of a project aimed at making the city more livable and aesthetically pleasing. At that moment, an unremarkable person entered the frame. There was another burst of laughter. Our old friend continued speaking without pause. There are some people who will not be persuaded, no matter what you say. My suspicious appearance must have prompted him to intervene. He tried to involve a police officer who happened to be passing by in the unpleasant conversation. The officer, who was tired after a long shift and on his way home, did not even listen. When my companion failed to succeed, I had the last word. The best thing to do is to take a souvenir photo. Now, in front of the ruins of the historic city which had been pushed into the darkness of history, I pressed the shutter button to capture the moment without giving him a chance to adjust his clothes. I know I should have asked his permission. Don't think this is an exception. Let me give you a few more examples. On a train journey through the forests of the north, I was taking pictures from the corridor window. A young man at least 20 years younger than me appeared beside me. "You're spoiling the atmosphere here," he said. Of course, I didn't understand what he meant at first. But when I looked back at the compartment he had come from, I saw a young girl surrounded by a few young men. Years later, I realized that there was always a grain of truth in that young man's words. But the examples don't end there. We felt that we were approaching the end with a short break. I think our old friend was experiencing mixed emotions. I don't know if it was the emotionality of old age that had overcome him, or if he was experiencing the exhaustion of coming to terms with the past. I will give 2 examples about my students, from whom I have always learned something, he continued. While working in a large district in the countryside, there were times when I found it difficult to understand the behavior of the local people and felt stuck between 2 worlds. The easy explanation that this was a place that had escaped being a village but had failed to become a city was not convincing. This place had a rich past, but it seemed to bear the traces of ancestors who had been driven from power. How could such a case, buried in the darkness of history and turned into a mystery, be explained in relation to today's problems? I came across a few troublesome students from the school on a deserted road. They blocked my path. "Teacher, we're gonna beat you up." At that moment, I realized the horror of what it meant to have burned my bridges. And one last example. That's not a classroom. There are too many students, and they're almost your age. You have no chance of establishing authority, and even if you fail, you can't just beat a student in class to relax. Naturally, he had successfully pushed the limits of my patience. After class, I said, "Follow me." In an empty room, I struck his palm with a stick. He snatched the stick from my hand before the second strike. He struck his own leg 3 times in a row with brutal force. At first, I thought this was a defiant challenge, as if to say, "That's not how you use a stick." No, it's not that simple at all. This time, the silence lasted a long time. After such unpleasant memories, we asked our old friend to sing a song to liven up the atmosphere. But we couldn't have guessed that he would inevitably draw us into his own world and take us back to the past. "Seriously," he said, "your request reminds me of the diva of the Republic." Of course, to talk about her, I'll have to give a long introduction. Instead of a song to clear the rust from our ears, we reluctantly surrendered ourselves to a dramatic history lesson. In the country's Great War a century ago, as the enemy retreated, its inhumane acts of burning cities and massacring civilians were once again recorded in the history books. In the city where I was born and raised, the screams of people trapped in the flames for 3 days were deeply engraved in the memories of those who remained. Gathering people inside a large building, often a place of worship, and then setting it on fire was just one of the war's ruthless practices. Those who managed to escape fled to the mountains, watching the devastation unfolding in the city with horror from behind the rocks or bushes where they hid. 3 days later, when rescuers arrived, the people did not emerge for a long time, believing them to still be enemies. The fire site, still smoldering with smoke rising from the ashes, was visited by local and foreign observers, who took notes and photographed the disaster. In both countries, those responsible for the war or those who evaded military service were tried and executed, either with or without trial. A population exchange took place between the 2 countries. For many years, both sides suffered greatly as they paid the economic price of the war in their countries. However, 7 or 8 years later, hostility gave way to peace and good relations. The last fire of the war had occurred in the country's second-largest city. About 5 years later, an exhibition was held on the site of the fire, followed by a fair, and then an international fair was opened on the expanded site. This fair played a role in broadening our horizons in our childhood. We were opening up to the world with pavilions from countries we knew nothing about except their names. Our imagination became more colorful, and we began to accept that there were other people living in this vast world besides us. Undoubtedly, the fairgrounds, which covered a vast area and were officially opened each autumn by the country's leading government officials, were not merely advertising spaces for certain countries and organizations. The restaurants, the amusement park with its electric toys, the parachute tower where people could jump for a small fee, the casinos, the zoo, the botanical garden with all kinds of plants and trees, the large pools, and much more, made it a place that attracted people of all ages. The zoo remained a focal point for visitors until it was separated from the fairgrounds in the early 21st century under the name Natural Life Park. The amusement park was so crowded that there was barely room to walk. The carousel, the haunted house, the chained chair, essentially a variation of a swing, the Ferris wheel, and the bumper cars were just a few of the countless attractions. This was a world where the fun lasted for 40 days and 40 nights, as in fairy tales. There was definitely something for everyone there. We would wander around for hours, pretending to be interested in the products on display in the pavilions, collecting lots of brochures, and then, late at night, with aching feet and exhausted, we would catch the last bus and head home to our nearby town. Every year, my grandfather, who came to visit us, would talk about a singer he met at a casino at the fair with his friends, who completely enchanted him. I should mention that my grandfather's world was far removed from art. However, when he saw the female singer commanding the entire cabaret on stage, he was so astonished that he stood there with his mouth and eyes wide open, unable to believe that such a voice could come from her. Even though he often didn't understand the words, there was something magical about her delivery that carried you away. She had a style that inevitably captivated you and a wide vocal range. After singing heavy songs whose words he didn't understand, she would transition to upbeat pieces that energized the audience, transporting them to another world. When my grandfather learned that she mainly gave concerts in the country's largest city, he regretted not having met her before, even though they lived in the same place. The first thing he did when he returned from visiting us was to find out which nightclub the singer performed at. Then, naturally, he became one of the diva's loyal and regular followers. The revelation of this legendary woman's talent was based on a master-apprentice relationship. Her fellow musicians were the first to notice the depth of her ability. It was enough for her to listen to a piece once to be able to perform it. When she was still a child, her age was increased so that she could perform on stage. With the notebook she kept, she quickly built up a wide repertoire. She chose songs according to the characteristics of her audience. If the regulars at the nightclub where she worked were prominent figures, she would perform classical pieces. But in nightclubs where the audience was mostly from the general public, she would sing more lively and upbeat songs. She performed not only within the country but also abroad, in distant countries around the world. Although she was not formally educated, the diva created her own unique style, setting her apart from the master names of her time. Over time, she mentored many of the leading singers of the country's music scene. He paused briefly. We all knew bits and pieces of this master artist's life story, but we had never encountered such a comprehensive presentation. Our old friend brought his stories to life. One night, an unexpected incident occurred on stage at the Fair Casino, where he was performing his art at the location of the cascading pool. In the middle of his song, a police officer stood before him. He was confronted with an order that left him stunned. The police officer said, "The governor is waiting for you at the restaurant next door. He wants you to sing." He did not acknowledge the police officer or respond to him, but he spoke into the microphone he was holding so that the governor could hear. Governor, I am singing songs for my fans here. Remember that you are the governor, and do not make such an offer to me." I don't know if the audience applauded or if a cold wind blew through the air. But what happened next? The governor imposed a ban on him performing on stage at the fair. This ban remained in effect for several years during the governor's tenure in the city. When the city's administrator changed, the ban was lifted. The diva reunited with his fans waiting for him at the nightclub named after him. The professional career of the prohibitionist governor continued with a steady track record of success in various positions within the bureaucracy. Initially, after serving as an officer in the army, he studied law and spent many years in senior management positions in the bureaucracy in various cities across the country. He served as a member of parliament. He eventually retired. Many years after that unpleasant incident at the fair, one day, while on her way to cross from one side of the sea to the other in a boat assigned to her in the country's largest city, the diva noticed a gentleman in distress at the pier. He also wanted to cross over, but apparently he was having trouble finding a boat. She invited him, and the gentleman accepted the invitation, likely with mixed emotions. As the boat began to move, the man approached Diva and introduced himself, saying, "Madam, I am the former Governor Arshin." Then, with a sense of embarrassment he could not hide, he said firmly, "I wronged you in the past. I apologize for that. Please forgive me." Diva did not remember who the man was, as many years had passed. That unpleasant incident from the past came back to her mind, and in response to his magnanimous apology, she behaved as one would expect a diva to behave. She said some comforting words, and somehow, they became friends. She invited him to the casino. Their closeness with the former governor continued for years from that moment on. However, while no one today even remembers the governor's name, Diva has secured her place at the forefront of our classical music, her name inscribed in gold letters. A melancholy atmosphere seemed to settle in. The finale of such a magnificent life story should not have ended this way. The owner of that perfect voice spent the last years of his long life with his rich talent gone. He had a partial stroke and was stuck in a wheelchair. No doubt, what was even more tragic was that he lost his voice. Under doctor supervision, he was first admitted to a nursing home, but soon after that, he was hospitalized. He passed away 30 years after leaving the stage. The country's prime minister issued a traditional condolence message upon the death of this state artist. Our old friend fell silent. There was a moment of silence. Then he continued his speech about the place and importance of music in human life with his memories. One day, while I was busy with flowers in the garden of my house, I heard a voice coming from the other side of the wall. The voice belonged to a girl around 12 or 13 years old. She was standing in front of a few sheep, singing a song to herself. The song, sung in a narrow vocal range and somewhat monotonously, had a refrain that repeated frequently, as if she were speaking in a foreign language, and I couldn't understand a single word. It seemed to go on forever. She was experiencing the same freedom she felt when playing, as if she were in control of her life while singing. He was alone with himself. I saw this in an adult during a shopping trip. His behavior was much more assertive than the child's. Without caring what others might think, he began to sing softly as he filled his bag with vegetables, ignoring the few men and women around him. At first, I was taken aback. Then I realized I was jealous of his freedom. In his behavior, there was an open protest, like in protest music. He wasn't protesting the high cost of living. He wasn't protesting injustice. It was as if his protest was against the rules, against the system. His protest was against everyone who didn't protest. Then he muttered, "Music as a means of expression," he said. "Or art." One of us interrupted. "She is declaring her freedom by protesting." Our old friend agreed. "Exactly. And she is doing it by singing." He seemed to be talking to himself. Actually, the difference between Diva and the other two examples is clear. She was an artist. While performing her work, she made her audience feel beautiful. That was her goal. In the other two examples, however, when they expressed themselves, others were not involved. 10 years later, Diva's heirs sought their legal rights. Their lawyers had probably found them and guided them as a source of income. A team of lawyers who followed the press, along with others, were researching any news related to the late Diva that they could use. Now, at any moment, one of Diva's fans could fall victim to fate. Indeed, my grandfather's admiration, which began 80 years ago, would eventually come back to haunt his grandson years after his death. I believe that my maternal grandfather's inexplicable passion for that magnificent voice continued until his death. I don't think my grandfather's son, my uncle, inherited this passion from his father, for he probably had no passion that was exclusive to any area of life. That's why I suspect that his inner world was closed and dull. But his son was different. Unlike his father, he was multifaceted and seemed to have a philosopher's curiosity about everything. He believed that his grandfather was strangely and inexplicably in love with that singer. This situation turned into a complex nostalgia in the grandson. After a long and turbulent life, he turned his grandfather's passion, which could not be turned into action, into something tangible. He decorated the walls of the small tea house he opened in his retirement, with old photographs and newspaper clippings of the diva, large and small. This retrospective was a look back at the past and showed the artist's development and change throughout his career. He often framed the photographs he had enlarged. He thought long and hard about placing his grandfather's photograph among them. Finally, he decided that it would be meaningful and added that exceptional photograph to the panel. On the other hand, he began collecting songs sung by the singer. His pure and innocent collection grew richer over time. And again, it was clear that he had begun to specialize in this field without even realizing it. Now, among the few customers at the tea house, there were also those who came from afar and took souvenir photos in front of the wall with the photographs. These exceptional customers would listen to 1 or 2 songs on cassette, drink a cup of tea, and then leave, never to return. A lawsuit was filed with the Intellectual and Industrial Property Rights Court, claiming that unfair profit and unfair prestige are being gained by using my mother's name. It was alleged that the business had used the artist's visuals and songs without permission, and instead of showing respect for her memory, her name was being used for commercial purposes. The family argued that using the famous artist's name and image for commercial gain harmed her memory and was against the law. The lawsuit highlighted that the company had pursued a commercial policy by exploiting the artist's popularity. The lawsuit for moral damages was accompanied by a claim for material damages, with the lawyer requesting that the damages be paid with interest for 10 years. The court ruled on the basis of the expert's findings and awarded 1/3 of the amount requested by the heirs. Nevertheless, this amount was still too high for my grandfather's grandson. Indeed, following the court ruling, the family was left in a state of severe psychological distress. He carefully placed the framed photographs on the wall and the newspaper clippings he had cut out into a box. He locked the door of the tea house, never to open it again. He walked along the coastal road for a while, carrying the box tucked under his arm. Then he sat down on one of the benches facing the sea. He lit a cigarette. His grandfather's passion had lost its meaning. He smiled bitterly. The inheritance he had inherited from him had lost its value. He slowly let the box float into the sea. He watched the waves for a while. Then he headed home.